Chapter 3, Evolutionary Mechanisms. This is Section 1, Natural Selection. We are going to start with this guy in a boat who's a pretty big deal. His name is Charles Darwin. And he spent 5 years in his boat, which is called, the HMS Beagle is the name of his boat. And he sailed all around the Galapagos Islands, which is, give you a little perspective here with the map. So off the coast of South America, there's a cluster of islands that are known as the Galapagos Islands. And he spent 5 years collecting specimens all throughout the Galapagos Islands. He collected turtles. He noted things about turtles, finches. He found seashells at the top of a mountain range. Here's my little seashell. Trying to make it look like a seashell, which is kind of abnormal for a seashell to be towards the top of a mountain. One would expect them to be farther down along the bottom, but he found fossilized seashells at the top of mountain ranges. A fossil is anything, any remnant or imprint of an organism, such as a seashell. We can have fossilized bones, teeth, anything that had some hard pieces. Soft-bodied organisms do not leave fossils very well. So he found fossils at the top of mountain ranges. He studied turtles. He studied finches. And the finches are kind of his claim to fame. That's what he spent the most time studying. And a finch is a type of bird. And he noticed that on the main island, they all appear to be the same, but as he traveled from island to island, you can think of the Galapagos kind of like the Hawaii, like Hawaii. There's several islands very close to each other. So we're gonna make some different islands that represent the Galapagos Islands. So different islands, and on the different islands, he noticed that the finches were different. I did not get that. Did not get the feet copied and pasted, but that's all right. So we have a variation of the finch depending on where it was observed. So if we put a few more finches on these other islands, we notice that, or I should say, Charles Darwin noticed that the finch was different. For example, on one island, he noticed, that their beaks were a lot longer than what they were on the mainland. And this probably helped them get food. On another island, they maybe had a slight curve to them, which maybe allowed them to find a different type of food. You can think like big seeds, small seeds, maybe a type of berry, harder seeds that were a little bit more difficult to crack open to eat. So the beak of the finch changed because of the food supply. And keep in mind, the finches didn't have any control over their shape of beak. Their shape of beak was coded for in their DNA. But over time, because of the available food supply, one shape of beak, depending on where they lived, was a little bit more, gave that finch more of an advantage, which means it most likely was able to reproduce more and pass on those genes for that certain shape and size of beak. So again, Darwin studied finches in the Galapagos, and he noted that there's a different beak size depending on where that finch lived. A population of finches is known as the organisms of one species living in the same place. Which means each island would have a different population of finches because they live in a different location. So we would have, in this example, we'd have 3 different populations because we have 3 different locations. A population could be more than one population can live in one space, depending on how many species there are living in that area. Populations do change over time. Organisms move in, they die off, the environment fluctuates, all of those types of things are variables. Individuals within a population have different traits. So even within one population, so if we look at just one of these islands, we might see that this finch right here has a beak that's maybe a little bit wider than the other ones. Not a lot, but a little bit. Or over here, this beak is a little bit shorter, I feel like, than the other two. So there's always just a little bit of variation within a population. A trait is any physical or behavioral characteristic. So something that's different about them in their appearance, or some trait that they have the ability, some ability that they can do. That's a behavioral characteristic. One of the reasons why we have different traits within our population is because not all offspring survive and reproduce. Some organisms die before they reproduce. Maybe they were eaten by a predator. Maybe there was a natural disaster. Again, there's several things that could cause that to happen. But we do know that if an organism has some advantage over the rest of that population, it is more likely to survive and reproduce. Individuals best able to survive tend to produce the most offspring, which again increases that trait that gives them an advantage, which means that those traits, some traits, are passed to their offspring. Okay, one thing to note is that this is a process that happens over long periods of time. And I want to emphasize the long in this because when we talk long periods of time in biology, we're talking millions of years, which is almost hard for us to picture because for me, a long time might be like 20 years. Or for you, it might be like 5 years, like, oh man, 5 years is so far down the road. But when we talk biology, we're talking a long period of time, which indicates millions of years. So lots and lots of time has passed. But what Charles Darwin noted is that traits that improve the chance of survival tend to be passed on. So the beak shape that helped that finch get more food was passed on from one generation to the next. Traits that improve your chance of survival tend to be passed on. And this goes all the way back to mutations in our DNA, whereas some mutations are negative, most mutations are neutral, and then some mutations are actually positive. They give us an advantage. So if we get one of those, then we are more likely to pass it on to our offspring because we're more suited for that environment. The traits that are less beneficial tend to die with those organisms. which again means if they give you a disadvantage, you're less likely to reproduce. And if you do, you're probably going to produce less offspring. And therefore that trait is less and less common. So here was the question that Charles Darwin kept asking over and over and over again. Why are there so many different species, and why do they change over time? How does that happen? Why isn't there just one type of finch? Why do we find the same type of turtle in very different locations? And where did all these fossils come from? Which is what we call today natural selection. So our official definition for natural selection is that natural selection is a mechanism that drives the evolution of a population so that traits that make an organism more likely to survive and reproduce are more likely to be passed on. Natural selection is a mechanism that drives the evolution of a population so that traits that make an organism more likely to survive and reproduce are more likely to be passed on. So we have a couple mentions of this word evolution, and we can kind of tell that those two things together lead us to this evolution. And I don't want evolution to be scary to you. We don't have to talk major changes, major shifts in a population. Evolution is very simply the change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. The genetic makeup of a population over time. And again, this time is most likely thousands and millions of years. But any change in genetic makeup is evolution. So again, the shape of the bird's beak, maybe we're just like increasing the amount of webbing between fingers or toes or something like that. Any small minor change is a source of, or I should say evidence of, evolution, change in genetic makeup over time. So our natural selection is what drives evolution. And we've probably heard, so we wrote out the long technical definition. Here is the short and sweet, like Twitter version of definition of our natural selection definition. So you probably have heard of survival of the fittest. That would be like the billboard sign for natural selection. Natural selection is very specific to an organism. It does not act on a whole group at a time. It acts on individual organisms. So it's up to, like in the finch's example, it would go bird by bird. Does this bird have a beak that is able to eat the seeds that are available in that environment? If it can eat them, then it will continue to survive. If it's not able to eat them, or maybe it's only able to eat a few seeds because it's really hard for it to do that, then it's just less likely that they produce as many offspring as everyone else that can eat all of those seeds. The word fitness, what fittest is referring to, is not necessarily being the biggest, the strongest, the fastest in a population. Fitness in biology is just describing how well an organism is able to survive and reproduce. It's the degree to which an organism's traits allow it to survive and reproduce. A great example of fitness is the length of a neck in the giraffe. Giraffes with long necks are able to reach more leaves than a giraffe with a really short neck. So therefore, because giraffes with long necks were able to eat more and better leaves, they were then producing more offspring, which passed the trait of having a really long neck on to their offspring. Whereas giraffes with short necks did not get as many leaves to eat, and therefore if they reproduced, it was very little and very rarely, and therefore the shorter neck died with those giraffes, kind of what we talked about up here. If it's improving our chance, then it is going to be passed on. If it is less beneficial, most likely it eventually dies with that organism. Again, think over hundreds, thousands, millions of years. This is not going to immediately die off in one generation. It is a process. So Charles Darwin, finches, natural selection, which drives evolution. So we're all about survival of the fittest in this first section.